New York Times this morning, and they have a headline here. And actually, it's at the bottom of an inside page, but the headline is, NATO force sent to Albania could serve as vanguard for a Kosovo invasion. It's by Eric Schmidt. I'll read a little bit about this. It says, the 24 Apache helicopter gunships and the long-range rockets that President Clinton has ordered to Albania, combined with as many as 8,000 NATO troops dispatched to aid refugees there, could quickly be turned into the vanguard of an invasion force if the order to do so came. What do you think?
I think that's probably right. There's no question that General Wesley Clark, who's the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, an American who is in charge of this campaign, has been asking for these Apache helicopters for some time because he can do more on the ground without risking troops quite so much with those. But I think it's also the case that it's been clear for so long that you cannot wage only an air campaign of this kind and not expect eventually to go on the ground, and that takes prepositioning. Now, part of the difficulty, of course, with this is that this entire campaign has really been, though it looks very military and very violent on both sides, has really been a war, a psychological war. So if we're continuing to try and send messages to Slobodan Milosevic, what message are we sending here? I think we're sending the opposite message that we're trying to send with the bombings in Belgrade, namely that now we are about to invade his country, which is just what he was trying to prevent.
Those of you who have been with us for a while know that Susan Woodward was the person who told us how to pronounce Kosovo. And you said at the time it's not Kosovo.
That's right.
Why do you think so many people mispronounce it in our media?
Well, there's a good side in the sense there's an old James Thurber story that says that when you pronounce a word in your own way rather than the way the people themselves pronounce it, we say Paris instead of Paris, that it means that we were getting to get to know it and making it our own. So that's all right, I think. But I also think that there has been over the last 5-6 years with this very, for me, tragic set of Balkan crises and the collapse of Yugoslavia, an increasing number of people who claim to have some expertise who really don't. And so you get further and further away from the knowledge base, professors of in the university, Slavic language scholars, political scientists who know about the country, further and further away from talking to them and more removed from people who have been there as an aid worker or a journalist, and they don't seem to care very much about how people themselves speak.
How long have you been with the Brookings Institution?
This is the end of my 8th year, actually, and a little footnote is that I came in September 1990 in order to write about the transition to markets and democracy taking place in Eastern Europe and what American policy could do to facilitate that, and told all my friends that I was very happy to get away from the problems of Yugoslavia. Well, 9 months later, the country fell apart, and that's been all.
And Susan Woodward wrote this book, came out in 1995, called Balkan Tragedy, Hopkinsville, Kentucky. On the moderate line, good morning. What would you like to tell us this morning?
Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
I'm for what we're doing in the Balkans.
Why?
I just think it's the right thing to do to help those people.
How far should we go?
Till we get Milosevic out of there.
What are the chances Susan Woodward will do that?
Well, one of the problems is that getting Milosevic out of there may not solve the problem. And so what I've seen, I think, I agree with you completely, we should be doing something. The question is what to do and how to be really effective in what we're trying to do. The effects of the air campaign in the last several weeks appear to have created more problems than we've solved. So each time we create a problem, we then shift what we're trying to do and have to adjust to that problem. If we try to get Milosevic in a military way, then I think we'll create a great deal of chaos and perhaps bring to power people who are much more dangerous than Milosevic. I know that's hard to imagine. So in my view, there's no question that you need to get rid of Milosevic, but the only way to do it is in a stable way, that is to say through elections, and we're not on that campaign at the moment. The other thing I think to keep in mind is that this conflict between the Albanians of Kosovo province and the Serbian government is a very real political conflict. It looks like a madman in Belgrade is creating horrible atrocities in Kosovo, but in fact it begins and will have to end over who controls the province is it self-governing? Is it independent? Does it belong to Serbia or not? A decision made by the great powers before World War I is still unresolved.
Our guest is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, has a master's and a PhD in political science from Princeton University, Las Vegas, on the Liberal Line. Good morning.
Good morning, Brian. Hello?
Hi, you're on the air.
Oh, okay. First, I have to tell you, you are my favorite host on C-SPAN. I come from the area. I was born in Montenegro, and I've been living in America for 30 years. I have a comment, and then I have also a question. My comment is that as much as I'm anti-Milosevic, I don't believe that he is the one that is a problem. If he wasn't the one, all Serbs would stand behind the Kosovo. That is something it's bred in us. Another thing is that I like to know is why this was not done peacefully. When they talk about Rambouillet plan, they don't say that Serbs could not accept this plan because this plan was actually giving independence to Albanians in 3 years. And my question is, if this Apache helicopter and these troops land in Albania and use Albanian soil to attack Kosovo Serbs or Serbia or Yugoslavia, whatever you want to call it, isn't that directly involving Albania in the war?
Susan Woodward.
Well, I think it is. And you say you come originally from Montenegro. There are many of us concerned that their efforts to use Montenegro, as you know, it has better roads than Albania in that area, and some very good ports that people might choose, the NATO powers might choose to use Montenegro to invade Yugoslavia.
Let me just show you this story in the Wall Street Journal is the only place I found it. Montenegro braces for possible putsch by James Darcy. Yugoslav Republic fears Milosevic camp to act. Serbs play down talk. What's that about?
Well, there are two things going on in the Montenegrin case. One is that about a year and a half ago, in fact in October, November 1997, a man who opposed Milosevic and is considered an opponent of him won the presidency of Montenegro. And he has been, over the last year and a half, increasingly opposing Milosevic at the federal level, where they combine forces, in a way that has led de facto to more and more Montenegrin independence. And so, from many people's point of view, Milosevic has considered the Montenegrin problem a bigger problem politically for him than the problem of Kosovo, and wants to reverse that effect of the election. So he has recently, only last week, changed the top general of the army who was stationed in Montenegro, and many people worry that that will lead to a military coup. I think that's not the case, but I do think that the tensions between Milosevic on the one hand and Montenegro on the other are being exacerbated very seriously by this refugee crisis of many of the refugees flowing into Montenegro. They're really internally displaced because it's all the same country, but we're calling them refugees. And the talk, at least in Washington, about how Montenegro can be used as a weapon against Milosevic. I think that's very dangerous talk.
Here's a front page picture you were just looking at from the New York Times this morning. It's in color. It's Edward Keating's photographs exclusively for the New York Times. It says an ethnic Albanian refugee from Kosovo rested in an open field near, and pronounce that K-U-K-E-S?
Kukës.
Kukës in northern Albania, where it was 43 degrees yesterday. Bartow, Florida, for Susan Woodward. Go ahead, please.
Morning, Brian.
Hi.
Morning, Susan. How are you?
Good morning.
I just have a comment. Have the American people lost their mind? We have as a leader a coward who ran from the Vietnam War because he didn't want to put himself in harm's way, yet he has no compunction whatsoever about sending our soldiers now to die. He created this refugee crisis with our bombing. That's my own opinion.
Thanks.
Well, you know, my view is that Slobodan Milosevic would have loved to be able to do what he's done, was ready to do it. It has exact parallels to what President Tuđman in Croatia did to Serbs in 1995, so he even has a model. But I don't think he would have been able to do it without the cover of the air campaign and the excuse, and especially the withdrawal of the monitoring force that we had in there so that we could do the air campaign. So I partially agree with you. I think, however, that in my view, the air campaign is not the way to solve this problem, and that the reason we're bombing instead of going in on the ground is because President Clinton, he's not alone, but he's the most vociferous about this, does not want to send troops. The sad irony is, just as in Bosnia, we didn't do anything effective about the war for 4 years because we didn't want to send troops, and then we ended up sending troops. So we are in that same dynamic now, in my view.
Here's another one of those articles. It started last week by Bradley Graham on the front page of the Washington Post. I'll ask you about this in a minute. Joint Chiefs doubted air strategy, and it's one of those sourced stories, meaning reliable sources saying that the military didn't like the idea of the airstrikes. Benton, Arkansas, for Susan Woodward. Brookings, go ahead, please.
Yes, I have two quick questions, Brian. Number one, and I ask this really, I need some information. I find that we talk about these things. I don't know the past of this situation very well. Why are we taking sides? I know that when I see these people displaced, I'm mad and I feel for them. But I'm trying to find out, why are we taking sides in what appears to be a civil war? And my second question is, what is an ethnic Albanian versus a plain Albanian?
On the cover of the Post, here is hundreds of refugees from Kosovo, mostly women, children, and elderly people, make their way along a little-used mountain path to a border crossing at the Albanian village of Prešit.
I have to see it.
Anyway,
yeah.
Gentleman's question?
Yeah. We make a distinction between an ethnicity and a nationality. A nationality is something that is associated with a state. We have an American nationality, for example. So a national Albanian is someone who is in the country called Albania. Whereas an ethnicity, we tend to use that word. You're right to ask it, because it's a very fine line that doesn't necessarily mean that to the people themselves. But an ethnicity means someone who is of that national background, culture, language, political identity, but is living in a country of a different nationality. So you could even say, for example, I'm a Scandinavian American, that my ethnicity is Scandinavian, but my nationality is Albanian. Ethnic Albanians are people who are of Albanian background who live in countries neighboring Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, even in Greece, for example, but also in Kosovo. I think on your first question, this is a civil war, but it is also a civil war with very direct, profound regional implications, that the effect of no resolution of the Kosovo conflict between the Albanians and the Belgrade regime and the people of Serbia, in many ways, as our earlier caller said, has direct implications, as we now see, for the stability of Montenegro, of Macedonia, both of which are still very fragile because they're new countries. The refugee flow will affect not only the survival of Albania itself, possibly, but as you can now see, could possibly flow into Greece, Bulgaria, destabilize an entire region, perhaps undermine the work we're doing in Bosnia. So I think that there are very good reasons, strategic reasons to be in, but we are using humanitarian reasons in order to legitimize intervention in what is, in fact, an internal affair.
Bradley Graham writes on the front page of the Washington Post, in the weeks before NATO launched its air campaign against Yugoslavia, U.S. military chiefs expressed deep reservations about the Clinton administration's approach to Kosovo and warned that bombing alone likely would not achieve its political aims, according to sources familiar with her thinking. The Pentagon's senior four-star officers meeting in closed-door sessions in the Pentagon's secure tank room argued that the administration should use more economic sanctions and other non-military levers to compel Belgrade to make peace in the rebellious Serbian province before resorting to airstrikes. Pleasanton, California, for Susan Woodward. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Richard Carroll, and I'm calling regarding this situation, which I believe to be a religious war. You're dealing with Christians versus Islamic peoples, and we haven't heard from the countries of Iran, Iraq, Gambia, Ethiopia, Egypt, Chad, Mauritania, Mali, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, UAE, Yemen, Afghanistan, Algeria, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Brunei, Tubanji, Guinea, we got Indonesia, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon. And if these people just donate a few of their troops, you're going to have a 500,000 to 1 million Islamic soldiers coming right over the hill.
Susan Woodward.
Well, there was a religious element in the cultural and political differences between the three nations of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosniaks. In this case, I would actually disagree with you in the sense that the real difference between the Albanians and the Serbs is language and the political and cultural consequences of that. Albanian is not a Slavic language, Serbian is. It's two entirely different families of tradition. The Albanians themselves are a mixed religion. About 70% probably are Muslim, as you say, but about 20% are Orthodox Christians, which is exactly what the Serbs are, and 10% are Roman Catholic, a larger proportion Roman Catholic in Albania, but that's the proportion in Kosovo. I do, however, think there is a sense in which, on the American side, beginning in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that we feel strongly about acting where there are Islamic populations in order to remind our allies, who are also from Islamic countries, that we are not ignoring them and that we think that their views are also important. There were stories last week in the British press that Iran had already offered weapons and troops to Kosovo. I don't really know myself how that is playing out, but if you are your views were taken seriously in Washington, then I think we would need, on the troop side, a United Nations and not a NATO operation. That might actually be more acceptable to Belgrade.
Here's a photograph that you find in most papers, and it was taken in an Albanian refugee from Kosovo in its B-L-A-C-E, Macedonia. Do you know how you pronounce B-L-A-C-E?
B-L-A-C-E, Blace.
Thousands continue to flee the province yesterday, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said they eventually would return home. Here's the color photo on the front page of the Inquirer. Grand Rapids, Michigan, for Susan Woodward. Go ahead, please.
Hey, good morning.
Hi.
I'm curious about the relationship that the Communist Chinese had with Albania in the past, and why they would come out in such strong support of the Serbian side, or at least opposition to the invasion.
Why do you think they did?
I really am not sure.
Okay, thanks.
You may remember in the history of the communist movement that there was one power center as a result of the Russian Revolution in Moscow, and that when the Chinese Communist Revolution took place during and after World War I, there was seen to be a bipolar split where Beijing, what we used to call Peking, became another potential center. One of the sad ironies of this conflict is that the Albanian Communist Party was created by the Yugoslav Communist Party, President Tito, in World War II, and there were efforts, part of the conflict between Tito and Stalin in 1947 and 48 was Stalin's desire for Tito not to control Albania. So when that split led the communist parties of Eastern Europe to turn against the Yugoslavs and impose sanctions, the Albanians sided with the Russians, the Soviet Union. That lasted about 10 years until the Sino-Soviet split that developed between 58 and 1961. And the Albanians, unlike anyone else in Eastern Europe, of the Communist Party governed states, switched to China as its patron. And for about 10 years, it had Chinese patronage. But then it broke with China as well and became completely isolated. My view about China now is that it has very little to do with that period of relationship with Albania, but its own very real concerns about international intervention and what it considers to be ethnic problems within its own country, Tibet being the most important one, but many of the provinces in the north that are also Islamic and are in various stages of potential insurgency that the Beijing is putting down are also a threat to the integrity of China's state. So in that case, they sympathize completely with the issues of Belgrade.
Here's a picture of the Prime Minister from China, Mr. Zhu, who will be arriving in the United States this week, a 6-day visit. Our next call is from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I have a couple questions. Bear with me. Everybody believes that the Serbian genocide, as they keep calling it, is deplorable, and I agree. But am I correct? during World War II, wasn't Albania aligned with Nazi Germany, and the Kosovar Albanians helped to literally eradicate or ethnically cleanse over 100,000 Serbs in Kosovo? And knowing this, if the president knew his history and listened to his generals and his experts, why, after 600 years of conflict and 2 world wars, would he get us into this?
Susan Woodward.
All of the Balkans were occupied by the Axis powers. Germany took a part of Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Italy. They each took a part. And the Albanian state became under the control of Italy. Your question relates in particular to the area of Kosovo that we're talking about, which was even then part of Yugoslavia. And at that point, as a result of the long-standing disagreements between the Albanian population and the Serb regime, the local Albanian population chose to side with the Axis powers. So you're right, there is not over 600 years, but only in this century, but enough since 1912, 1913, a series of ongoing conflicts over control over this territory. The discussion that one hears often, that you mentioned, about whether Serbs were massacred by Albanians in Kosovo does not have much support in the record, but there is certainly an issue of Serbs having been the victims of genocide in World War II in many areas of former Yugoslavia, and I think that you're right that it does influence the way people perceive it. I also think, however, that the word genocide has been badly diluted and tarnished both by us and applying it where it doesn't yet, perhaps by intention, but doesn't yet apply, and also even by political leaders in former Yugoslavia in the 1980s. Serbs were saying that pressure to leave the republic under, the province under Albanian majority rule was a form of genocide, which of course I certainly don't think it meets that criterion. So on the other hand, I think that the reason we're involved is that we do see that until this conflict is solved, then the rest of the Balkans won't be stable. So again, the issue for me is how we're solving it, and that it's a lot of the unfinished business of the way we, in fact, undermined the Yugoslav state in the 80s and leading up to 91 and led it to its dissolution when, in my view, that wasn't necessary.
How much time have you spent in that part of the world?
I have been going back and forth to the Balkans for 34 years. I hate to admit how long, every 3 years or so.
And what's the longest amount of time you spent there?
18 months when I was doing my dissertation research for my PhD in political science, and I was in the capital of Zagreb, Croatia, but traveling all over the place.
And how long over these years have you worked for the UN?
I worked for the UN in 1994. I was asked by the special representative of the Secretary General, who was head of the UNPROFOR mission, the UN Protection Forces, to create an analysis and assessment unit of experts so they could have some expertise on the country, and I spent 9 months there.
Smyrna, Georgia, on the Liberal line. Good morning. You're on with Susan Woodward.
Hello. I've been listening to just about everything that has come on the TV about this, and been reading the paper and really trying to keep up. And I have only heard one mention of Kofi Annan, and I'm curious that what kind of role would he be playing? It seemed like that he would have at least be on record for something, some position about this situation. And one other thing I want of a comment was that one caller a few days ago called in to, she was on the Serbian side and said that really real disturbed and wanted to know if the NATO forces were going to pay for the bridges and what all they've destroyed. And I thought, well, what are the Serbians going to pay for all those houses that they burned and all the punitive damages to the refugees and the cost of NATO and all the humanitarian costs that have heaped up? Of course, that's way in the future, I suppose, and maybe that's a rhetorical question, I don't know. But after she mentioned that, I just wondered.
Susan Woodward.
Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has made a few statements very much in support, I think, of this action, but very much disturbed, if not opposed, to the fact that NATO powers are doing this without going back to the United Nations for the legitimating authority. The NATO response is that the UN Security Council resolution last October that told Milosevic to withdraw his forces back to the limit before the campaign began and help protect the Kosovo Albanians was not being implemented, and so they could go ahead. But it's a really good question you asked, because as a result of the UN actions in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which after all were a decision of the Security Council and therefore the United States as its lead permanent member, to send in a humanitarian operation to Bosnia didn't stop the war. And we were very, in this country, critical of the UN and have shifted to NATO for that reason. And this is an ongoing, very important issue as we move towards the celebration of the 50th anniversary of NATO, which happened yesterday, but the celebration will be in Washington on the 23rd to the 25th of April, about what this really is about in this international intervention. It's an effort to build up NATO as the caretaker and protector of European security, and really to move the United Nations out of the way. And in that regard, your question about the monies that will be spent on reconstruction of the houses and farms of the people in Kosovo who are fleeing at the moment, and of the bridges and buildings and so forth that NATO bombing and destroying, it looks like the European Union will probably end up spending most of the money on that, and some countries, including the United States, will contribute to it. I think the capacity for people in the region to pay for this damage doesn't exist, especially since we've had sanctions, economic sanctions on Serbia since May 1992. They don't have the money to do it. I think the reason will be, and I understand why you say what you're saying, the reason will be given that when that happens, we are expecting that there will be a change of government in Belgrade, and that it will be to people whom we will want to support.
The media covers the media. Howard Rosenberg, headline in his piece in the LA Times today, Monica's overthrown in face of war. It took a war to dislodge Monica Lewinsky from television. Only a few weeks ago, CNN was yet another 24 hours to fill, assigned a reporter and a camera crew to accompany Lewinsky on her British book tour. They could have danced all night with her and nearly did. But what a difference NATO airstrikes make. For nearly 2 weeks, it's been bombs away on the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal that continued to preoccupy much of the media, even after the president had managed to keep his job after being impeached. All of that now seems a distant memory. Not that Lewinsky, who is reusable by the media as John Benet Ramsey, won't be back, but by this time this is printed, she may have already been resurfaced on a TV show with spare time on its hands. We go to Rockville, Maryland next. Go ahead, please. Or actually, it's New York City. You're next.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Fine. Welcome. You're on with Susan Woodward.
Ms. Woodward, first of all, my compliments on your knowledge of Europe and the Balkans. It's absolutely refreshing to see a point of view that's not biased. My question is twofold. Number one, what do you think of the propaganda the Serbs are presenting? It seems to be united from Canada, from the United States, and from Belgrade. It's all directed towards NATO, the fact that the refugees are fleeing because of the bombs, not because of the Serbs burning. It represents a point of view that is preposterous to the West, I believe, at least to me. And secondly, Milosevic, I believe, is nobody's fool, and it's not a fool at all. He has an aim, and the aim is not, I don't believe it is to sort of depopulate Kosovo, which it has done effectively. Obviously, he's going to use this, in my point of view, to his advantages to get his goal or to get his aim across, because he certainly cannot out-duel NATO, not in this instance or any instance. Now, I'll get off the line because I'd like to listen to your answer. Thank you very much.
You know, it's very interesting, the propaganda coming, or you could just say reporting, coming out of Belgrade and official sources has a parallel to what's coming out of NATO and Pentagon sources. Namely, both of them, in my view, are trying to wage a war against each other on the psychological level. So what we're hearing is directed at political audiences rather than being accurate. We're trying on the NATO side, for example, to influence Milosevic's thinking, and I think Milosevic is trying to influence the thinking of his own population. So if he can emphasize NATO as an enemy, that, like the Germans in World War II, are now bombing Belgrade, and if he can attribute the fleeing refugees and the murders and atrocities to the NATO bombing and to the Albanians, but not, he can win more unity among the Serbs in what is going to be a very long campaign. I think that it's really very difficult for us. And now I've forgotten what the second question was.
And so have I. We're looking at pictures, by the way, from Newsweek magazine. It'll come back to us as we go. Let's go to Rockville, Maryland for Susan Woodward. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hi. I have a question. If you refer to page A12 in the Washington Post, there's a map that says historical boundaries in the Balkan region. Just to the right of that, atrocities on all sides. Okay, it talks about atrocities and massacres were committed on all sides as Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, and Albanians sought to grab as much land as they could from the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, now I'm looking at those two maps there, and they're different. I see Austro-Hungarian Empire. To me, the history of this place, the borders have changed so much that I just wonder what type of claims, you know, these people called Kosovo Albanians, present-day Kosovo Albanians, have to wanting this to be their own land. And my second question, I might add just real quickly, that northern region of Yugoslavia with the dotted line on it that's got the name that you can't pronounce, begins with the letter V, I think. What's the story with that part of the nation?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, one of the reasons I like the question you've asked is that if you look at much of the world, particularly African continent, most of the Middle East, the same set of problems are there, namely that the claims of one nation to a particular territory can't really fully be substantiated because there are more nations claiming territory and the same territory than there is territory. If you look, for example, at the claims that the Palestinians and the Israelis have for the same territory, you get a sense of how we have got to find a different way to solve these problems than to give people nation states and only give minority status to individuals who are of another nationality. I think if we find another reason for people to have states, that would be much better. And also, you're right that one of the problems fueling this conflict, in this case between the Albanians and the Serbs over Kosovo, is that at different points in the history, each one was governing and the other was a minority. So each one of them now, sometimes the Albanians governing, sometimes the Serbs governing, so each one of them feels that they were the victim in the past of oppression towards them. So while we can see very clearly that the Serbs are in power and that they have the military might against the Albanians, many of them see the Albanians as taking advantage of a position they had before to gain international support for their claims. There is no way that there can only be one claim to the territory, but they all have some claim. The Vojvodina is an especially interesting area. Voivod means just a duke or a ruler, and so it's a dukedom is the mean, or province as we would now call it. In Serbia, in the federal system that was created by the communists after 1945, instead of the unitary state before World War II, the states of what are called the republics, but we would call states of the federation, were drawn according basically to national and ethnic boundaries. And Serbia was given two autonomous provinces, Kosovo one, Vojvodina the other, unlike the other republics, because these are areas of large ethnic minorities, and the idea was to give them some kind of self-governance within Serbia. Vojvodina is as mixed a bag as you could possibly find, even more than Macedonia, where there are now more than about 53% Serbs at the moment, but lots of Croats, lots of Hungarians, Romanians, Czechs, Slovaks, Vlasi, Belarusians, people who fled from the Russian Revolution and went south. And one of the sad things for me about the bombing campaign, which is now clearly in some ways under military decision of what would be strategic objects against the Yugoslav army, is that the bombing of the bridges over the international waterway, the Danube, at Novi Sad. Novi Sad is the capital of this province you've asked about, Vojvodina. And this is a region which is, in many ways, the most multi-ethnic still left in the Balkans, something I think we would want to support. And it's a region that has consistently, since elections began in 1990, sent opposition parliamentarians to Belgrade. So they've been consistently against Milosevic, and now we're bombing them. I think the political consequences of that, they're unforeseeable, but I think they're not good.
In about 15 minutes, we will have Cesare De Carlo, an Italian journalist, been at the White House since 1986, represents 3 newspapers, will be our guest. And then Gordon Baum, Council of Conservative Citizens, CEO since 1985, will be here at 8:45 East Coast time. We go next to Wichita Falls, Texas, for Susan Woodward. Go ahead, please.
What I'd like to say is what is the most aggravating about this is I've read quite a bit on the Balkans, and I'm very interested in it, but the feedback of the media that shows refugees the same picture that is 4 or 5 days old. It is not new pictures. And also of the Albanian leader they showed on TV the other day. Serb TV is the worst I have ever seen. It reminds me of the old Soviet Union. But they showed this leader shaking hands. Now, CNN pulled back their files. I saw this on CNN. And this picture is 2 years old. They found that out. Now, nobody else reports it. All these other little TV stations like MSNBC, the cable and all that, nobody knows what one other station is saying. This is TV and the media, except for C-SPAN, is the most irritating, aggravating thing, because I'm a news junkie, I guess, that I have ever seen in my life. I saw the same baby 5 days in a row, getting her water with her hand and washing her face. It is not new. Now, last night I saw finally on ABC, I think, or someplace, where they had the pictures of where the new area was set up, and they were pulling these people out. But there's only been one station that has shown this. Now, I don't know what you do about it. And, Brian, could sometime you get Warren Christopher to come back, and if you can, you know, and see if you could get him from, when we drop food from Germany, you know, over and over, and everybody kept telling him how long it was on pallets. Now, I'd like to hear, I remember all this from the very beginning.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Christopher did have a piece, I think, in yesterday's Washington Post. Any comment on the media and the way they're covering this?
Yeah, I'm actually quite sympathetic to what she has to say, because you begin to get a sense that you're not sure what to believe and what independent source of information is. It's a problem of modern warfare, among other things, that, as I think I said quite early in this program, that what NATO is doing is not so different than what Belgrade is doing, namely they're waging a war through the media. That's maybe very effective, but it leaves people like you and me not knowing what to believe. And I also worry a great deal about the way in which pictures have driven foreign policy. There's no question that there are terrible victims in this story, and that the pictures we're seeing of the refugees fleeing is real, but it doesn't tell you everything. We don't see, for example, the internally displaced in Kosovo, which is as large a number. We don't know what's happening. We don't know, when we see pictures of people, what their ethnicity is, and yet we attribute it. I thought this story earlier that we noticed from the LA Times, where Monica Lewinsky and her story has been replaced by this story, gives you a sense of how we go one, and yet if you look at that picture, you'll see in this LA Times story that alongside this Monica story, there is a photograph of the man who has been indicted as a war criminal for terrorizing Bosnia, in the eastern part of Bosnia in 1992, and about to send troops to his own paramilitary gangs to Kosovo, and we just see a photograph, and how do we know whether to judge it? He looks perfectly normal.
A man named Arkan.
Yes.
Surprise, Arizona. For Susan Woodward, you're next.
Yes. The question I have, and I just want to reiterate some what other callers have said, and that the bombings that are going on in Serbia, my experience has been that they tend to be indiscriminate. And what targets are we hitting, and are there any Serbian casualties? And the second part of that is, in terms of, as you alluded to earlier, the bridge that was like a multi-ethnic, is the action by NATO in entrenching Milosevic that much more in his position in terms of raising the nationalism in Serbians?
Thanks.
I agree with you on the second point. I think it's making Milosevic much more firmly in power, maybe not in the long run, but it follows a pattern of what we've been doing for the last 8 years, that our actions towards him seem to strengthen him, just almost always at a point where he is weakening. At this point, his own party has only 30% of the vote in Serbia. He's having to rule in coalition, and now we're just really helping him out, and we're helping him also use the NATO bombing as an excuse for more repression, to shut down the universities where there are opposition voices, to close the independent media. So it's not only in the nationalism, but in the explicit acts that he's taking. This leads to the bombing. I don't think it's indiscriminate. I think the targets have been chosen very, very carefully by the NATO planners. But they do have two very different aims, and that may be why it looks indiscriminate. On the one hand, they're trying to destroy or they say degrade, but I think in the end destroy the military capacity. That means both the army and the militarized section of the internal security police of the Yugoslavs, so that if we end up having to send in ground troops to take over Kosovo province in order to make it possible for the refugees and displaced persons to go back home, which is, I think, the way we are headed now, very much like the sort of idea behind what we did for the Kurds in northern Iraq. In that case, we don't want opposition for the Yugoslav army, and so we are trying to prevent that, push them out, and destroy their capacity to respond. And so many of those targets are military. Command and communications, tanks, supply lines, fuel lines, and airfields, and so forth. The other part is the psychological pressure on Milosevic. We still seem to have simultaneously the original goal alive of pressuring President Slobodan Milosevic to agree to political agreement that would allow us to go in with peace implementation forces and therefore not at risk. It's hard for me to believe that we still think that that's in the game, but that's why we're doing some of the strikes in Belgrade, for example. This is part of the war of nerves to get him to cave in before our internal disagreements about this hurt us.
For Susan Woodward, Miami, Florida, you're next.
Okay.
You're on the air, sir. Please turn your television set down. Go right ahead.
Okay. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the Ukraine, which is a neighboring country on the other side of Romania. This is from the Ukraine Post, Kiev Post on Saturday. The story is that the Rada, that's their parliament, ratifies the Black Sea Fleet deal with Russia. And it goes along with another story, left uses NATO to turn Ukraine back to Russia. And I think one of the political aspects that's not been written about too much in this country in our papers is what the effect is of our bombing over there on the relations that we had with Russia and with Ukraine. Ukraine, you know, got their independence 9 years ago after 500 years of Russian occupation. And they were developing a nationalism spirit. But now with our bombing over in Yugoslavia, the leftist people, and they dominate the parliament over there because they're left over from the time of the Russian occupation, have brought Ukraine back closer to Russia.
All right, thanks. Your reaction?
You know, I think it's a really important issue to raise the long-term consequences of this NATO bombing campaign. It will depend, of course, how it comes out. There is still a possible positive outcome, but it will, even if it's positive, depend on the spin that the NATO spokespeople and officials are able to put, and President Clinton and his cabinet are able to put on what we did. We will have to argue that this was done for regional peace and stability, to implement and enforce international humanitarian law, and not feel that NATO has now become a threat to any country that has difficulties with its internal populations and its order. There is a sense I was getting. I was in London during the week that the bombing campaign began, and also in Switzerland, and there was a sense there that there were many people who were very uneasy about what NATO was doing. They wanted something done. They cared a great deal about the victims of this conflict, but at the same time they were very worried that NATO, and particularly the United States, were entering a new phase of militancy where no country was safe. Now, I don't think that's where NATO intends to go at all, but if you begin to undermine the views that the end of the Cold War had, that now we were much safer from international conflict, and believe that NATO has become the arm of a new imperialism, we will have a lot of work to do, in my view, to overcome that.
Midland, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, C-SPAN listeners. Ms. Woodward?
Yes.
A war like this is caused by, not just by one Hitler, but by many Hitlers, both inside and outside of Yugoslavia, you know, including those people who sell arms to produce these things, you know. Now, I think this problem can be solved by religion. All the major religions of the world should excommunicate all these Hitlers, you know, that threaten to excommunicate them, you know. I think that way this will be a religious missile right into the souls of these people.
How much of this is religious?
Well, in my view, not very much of it is religious. This is really about political power and control over economic assets. These really begin as economic conflicts, and people find that control over a government and a state is the easiest avenue to political power. There is certainly a religious element, you're right, in the claims that people make. Their own identity is in part defined by their religion in this part of the world, but there are different traditions in that part of the world, and only one of them uses excommunication. So I think you and I should find some equivalent mechanism. One of the sad parts, however, is that the three leaders of three of the major religions, beginning with the Pope and the Patriarch, the head of the Orthodox Church, which the Serbs are largely, have made a plea for an Easter recess in the bombing, and no one would listen to them. So it's very clear that at a sort of individual level, religion may still matter a great deal to people, and they're a sense of who they are and how they find meaning in life. But at the political level, churches only have so much influence over this.
Cesare De Carlo, an Italian journalist, will be here in just a moment. How do you pronounce your town in New Jersey, please?
Ottawa.
Good morning. You're on with Susan Woodward.
Good morning. I want to say something to the people that say NATO should be in this because of the refugee situation. I want to bring out one fact that I know about, one name, no history stories. One of KLA men's, Becky Mezreku, told the reporters that he personally killed 3 women, 2 children, 11 and 7 years old. Then his brother, Leon Mizreku, said that he kidnapped hundreds of civilians under the leadership of Gandhi Krasniqi, who you people idolize. And then they raped them in front of the villagers, these villagers, and all this in this village called Kletska that you're worried about, that it's being burned.
Who do you say, who are you people who idolize which person again?
Gandhi Krasniqi, the person that calls from Albania, saying how what the situation is on Kosovo, and you're saying he's the KLA leader and all this.
Do you idolize him?
No, I don't. But I do think you have a point that there was, until the end of 1997, The Kosovo Liberation Army were people who were largely outside the country. Many of them had origins in Kosovo but hadn't lived there for a long time, had their sources of money elsewhere, were based on the other side of the border in Albania. We're trying to get the political liberation of not only Kosovo but all Albanian areas by violence. We can talk about why it came to that in the relations between the authorities in Kosovo and the authorities in Belgrade. But there was a period where the Serb argument that these were terrorists certainly seemed to fit our definition of terrorists. They have now, as a result of the Yugoslav army and police response, gained so much support from at least the villagers in Kosovo that you can no longer think of them quite that way. And we are in the process not of glorifying them, but of seeing them as legitimate, and in part so we can have bargaining relationships, so we can actually talk to the people who are in control of the weapons. But one of the issues that people, I think, are not paying attention to at all in this horrible refugee crisis is that this conflict in Kosovo is also within the Albanian population, between those people in the rural sector who have supported the Kosovo Liberation Army and the urban professionals who will, if there is ever either a self-governing or an independent Kosovo, be the most important people in terms of whether it's stable and prosperous. They're the people with skills. They will be the people who govern, and they are very much against these methods. So we will have to find a way to protect those urban professionals with ability to compromise, people who don't resort to force in the end if Kosovo is to be stable.
Chester, Virginia, for Susan Woodward.
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Ms. Woodward. Last night I was talking to a lifelong friend who's a machinist, and he's working currently with 2 Bosnians that came over here 2 years ago on through a church program. During the first couple days of the bombing campaign, we saw nothing but women and children streaming across the borders in all these other countries, and then we were questioning, where are the men? Where are the men? Well, according to the Bosnians that my lifelong friend worked with, he said, well, the difference between the KLA and what's going on now is that the KLA would have just killed the women and children. They wouldn't even allow them to leave. Ms. Woodward, do you believe this is any, is this just bias? Could this be possible fact? And I'll hang up and listen to your answer.
Well, I have no basis for making that judgment. I tend to discount it. What is interesting about the men is that it's clear that at the beginning 80% of the flow were women and children and elderly men. But if you look at the pictures over the last week, now there are as many younger men and middle-aged men as you would expect in the population. There were claims made at the beginning that, not the one that your friend told you, but that the Yugoslav army were very much in parallel with what happened in parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war, that the Yugoslav army were holding back the men with the aim of executing them. That turned out to be false. And to the extent that men were being held back, it was the Kosovo Liberation Army who were trying to recruit them for the struggle that they think is still to come. To the extent that they have now gotten a much larger base for their army, the manpower to match the very sophisticated and large number of weapons they've been able to buy, I think we need to remember that that will be an issue if NATO forces go in on the ground. They will have to deal with that new army as well.
Coming up next, we're going to talk to Cesare De Carlo, an Italian journalist, and then Gordon Baum will be with us. He's the CEO of the Council of Concerned Citizens. Pulled this off the web this morning, and it's a piece about the A Lincoln Nobody Knows, meaning Abraham Lincoln, and some of the material from the Concerned Citizens. It says, for Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant, surely the most evil American in history, who, to preserve his own political regime, brought death to at least 600,000 Confederates and Yankees and destroyed the lives and the way of life of the uncounted millions of Southerners. Later it says on religion here about Abraham Lincoln, although he was fond of using religious imagery in his speeches, Lincoln was non-religious, even anti-religious. And then it goes on to say his sanity. Space does not permit even a summary of Lincoln's aberrant mental aberrations. Throughout his adult life, Lincoln was delusional to the point that we would today call him psychotic, and those in his times would have said he was touched in the head. We'll hear some more about this as the morning goes on. Columbus, Ohio, last call for our guest, Susan Woodward. Hello, Columbus. You're on the air.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. I do support our action here in Kosovo, and I'm giving it the Albanian pronunciation, as you noticed.
I did.
One of the things that really bothers me about this whole conflict, that it started to bother me back in Bosnia, is I think that we saw the Serb concentration camps. The Serbs, and everyone gasped and said, oh, never again, and then everybody was quiet, well, let's conciliate, blah, blah, blah. And then we saw the Serbs driven out of Krajina, and everyone gasped. It was a terrible thing. The Serbs, of course, forget that they originally took up arms in the Krajina, set up a separate little entity, refused to negotiate. And now we see in Kosovo where nobody supported the Albanian Liberation Army. The West did not. The West kept saying they didn't. Everybody knew this was going to lead to trouble. In the Serb mind, however, the West immediately was supporting the Albanians, this, that, and the other thing. We turned against the Serbs in Kosovo when their response to the KLA was to go into villages and, at a very small scale, but still try to terrorize the people to keep them from supporting the KLA. They went after civilians because it was a little difficult to go after those armed men. And I don't see the Serbs as in any way facing the reality of what they've done. I mean, I think they are now on their TV, and I heard a Serbian woman on Charlie Rhodes, who had been I think formerly in the Serbian government, coming out saying that, well, the villagers originally, before the NATO intervention, were fleeing not from the Serb army, which they were, but they were fleeing to the cities to get away from the KLA, when in fact what was happening was the population of Kosovo was increasingly supporting the KLA because of the actions of the Serb army.
Thanks, caller. We're going to have to let you go. We're running out of time. Last comment from you?
The sad part of this story is that everybody is right a little bit and not 100%. And the story, for example, about the Serbs in Croatia, I could give you some facts that would make it a little more two-sided rather than one-sided. And in Kosovo, we often forget about the Serb minority. The Serbs you're talking about are the representatives of the government, the police and the military, who are waging a counterinsurgency campaign, which we're very familiar about from our assistance in Latin America. But the Serb minority themselves are there. In many ways, they have more in common with Albanian neighbors. The language they speak is a Serbian that people who are in Belgrade don't really recognize it because it's more like Albanian. And these people need protection too. It would be just so much better if we could find a different way to solve these problems.
Susan Woodward, our guest, originally from St. Paul, Minnesota. For the last 8 years, been with the Brookings Institution Senior Fellow, and has a book out called Balkan Tragedy. Can you still buy that from Brookings?
You can. Yes, you can.
Coming up.